Today's lesson is on chapter 2. It's entitled Holding On to Faith in the Midst of Suffering. This is kind of a continuation of what Job is enduring here as we continue on. Can anybody give me some reminder about what we talked about the last couple weeks? Where are we at in the story so far? Satan's still at work, for sure. We were introduced to Job. How was Job described? What kind of person is Job? He's a righteous man. He's upright. He fears God, turns away from evil. He's richly blessed by God in terms of his possessions as well as his family at the time. But then in last week's lesson, we learned about this test that was done to Job, right? What was Satan's accusation against Job? That God's protecting him, but specifically, what did he accuse Job of? Right, he's only serving you because you're blessing him, right? You're giving him all this great stuff, so of course he's going to serve you. Right? That was the accusation, that Job is just in it for what he can get out of it, right? That's why he loves you, is because of what he can get out of it. So what did God allow Satan to do? Allowed to put him to the test, to take all of his possessions to see what would happen. So God allows Satan to have power over all that Job has, and then in turn, Satan destroys all that Job has. He takes it all away from him. So what happens in the end? The end of last week's lesson. How did Job respond to having everything he had taken away from him? Yeah, the summary of last week's lesson is God was vindicated, right? He said, no, my servant Job is righteous, and he serves me because that's the proper thing for him to do. It's not because of his blessings. It's not because God was taking such good care of him. And in the end, he was proven right. Job was vindicated. God was vindicated. We saw that Job did serve God for nothing, meaning that he served God not for what he could get out of it, but he served God because he loved God, and that was the right thing for him to do. So this first chapter ends in success, and we see that Job has shown that he does serve God for nothing. He does not serve God because of the hedge God had put around him, or blessings that God had given him, the work of his hands and all the possessions that he had. Job lost his children, all of his possessions, all of his wealth, yet he did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's verse 22. Further and more importantly, God has been vindicated. God was charged with doing too much good for righteous people, so that they cannot serve God for who God is, but only serve God for selfish reasons. So the accusation made against Job was more generally an accusation against everyone. So of course, God, if you keep blessing all these people, they're going to serve you. Not just this person, Job, but that's not what we found in the case here. That there are people that serve God because they love God and not out of the gain or benefit that they get from it. Okay, any other thoughts on that first chapter before we go into chapter 2 today? Okay, so our story, of course, doesn't end in chapter 1. Chapter 2, let's pick up and read Job chapter 2. If somebody could read verses 1 through 3. Does this passage sound familiar? Pretty similar to chapter 1, isn't it? The first three verses of chapter 2 start again, just as we read in Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. It's a day when the sons of God were presenting themselves before the Lord. Satan is doing all that he does, which is what? Going to and fro through the earth. And again, the reminder there is God knew what Satan was doing, but the reason for the question is there is for our benefit so we can understand. And again, we join back to the connection with 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Satan's always on the move, looking for whom he can devour, whom he can accuse before the Lord. He's always looking for those opportunities to make accusations against us. So that's Satan's purpose and his motive. God draws Satan's attention again to Job. What does he say about Job? About the same thing, right? He's still blameless. He's still upright. He still fears God, turns away from evil. Basically, Job's a righteous person, right? He's still describing Job in that same kind of terms. Do we notice anything new this time in this passage that we didn't pick up in chapter 1? Okay, there's none like him on the earth. We talked about that in chapter 1, though. You incited me against him. Interesting. Right, he's holding fast his integrity, and then, as was mentioned there, at the end of verse 3. Yeah, so he's had everything taken away from him. He's still holding fast his integrity. But the interesting part there is the end of verse 3. Although you moved me or incited me against him to destroy him, how? Without cause, without reason. What do you think that means? Mm-hmm. So Satan is trying to, in verse 11, and this repeats in chapter 2 again, Satan is trying to get God to stretch out his hand against Job, and God says, no, I'm not going to do that. I will allow you to stretch out your hand against Job. Again, I don't know if that answers this question. Okay, that's an interesting point. It kind of gives more context to this question. Okay, so that's an interesting point. So you're saying that Satan is trying to get God to stretch out his hand and strike down Job, but instead what God says is he allows Satan the power to have control over what Job has, to strike out his hand against Job. Okay? Anybody else want to chime in on that one?
How else could God have proven that Job was a good man like he said, had he not tested him?
Right.
God tests, Satan tempts.
Good point. So God tests, Satan tempts, right? We wouldn't know how good a person Job was without these trials that Job is going through. That's very true. So in this passage, we see God declares Job's maintained his integrity. He has remained blameless. He has not cursed God to his face, which is what Satan told him would happen. Job does not have false motives. Job is not hypocritical. He's faithful to God, despite having lost his children and all of his possessions. So to touch on this last thing that we were just talking about and maybe think about it a little deeper, I'll just ask, who is responsible for what happens to Job? Who is responsible for what happens to Job? Is it Satan or is it God? Okay. So God allows Satan to do it, but Satan still chose to do it. So you would say Satan is responsible. Okay. That seems reasonable. Daryl?
There is actually a way we can say Job is responsible.
Okay.
Because if Job had given in, he wasn't enough out of him to look at.
So Job is responsible because if he hadn't been upright, then this test wouldn't have come to him, at least in this way. Okay. Certainly, yes. Yeah, Job is certainly responsible for his actions. Okay. Okay. Oh, interesting. So we're going to talk about that. God doesn't do evil to us, but he is allowing Satan to do this. Okay, Jan? Yeah, that's really interesting. So Satan takes away all of his possessions, so Satan is responsible, certainly. But what we just read there in verse 3, God still takes ownership of what happens, right? He doesn't say that, well, Satan, you did all this to Job, and now, why would you do that? And I got to go fix this now because you did all this bad stuff. No, he says he takes responsibility for it. It's very interesting in verse 3. Jimmy. Mm. Right. Right. So yeah, we're certainly all tempted, and we're all faced with these trials. But as you mentioned, we learn in the New Testament we're not going to be tempted beyond what we can bear. Right. There's always going to be that way of escape. So clearly, this was a trial that God thought that Job could bear, and he certainly did. Yeah. Being used as a pawn without knowing it. You could maybe say that, but I think the lesson for us, though, is, hugely valuable. That's the whole point of us studying this book, right? So there's still huge value in it. But yeah, it doesn't seem fair what happens to Job, does it? So back to this point about who is responsible. So one important thing is that the scriptures teach us there is nothing that happens in this world that is not under God's rule. And I think that's an important point. We do know that God is in control, right? That God is in control of what happens. And I think that's some of the reason why God takes this ownership of what happens to Job. And I think sometimes we're kind of tempted. I've heard other lessons and before try to explain this away and say, well, it wasn't really God that did this. This is what Satan did to Job, right? Try to make an excuse for God so that he's not really responsible. It's Satan that's responsible for what happened. But if you go down that path, you're kind of giving Satan control beyond what God allowed, right? Or you're trying to put Satan and God at odds with each other. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. My first lesson, I tried to avoid using that word tested because it's like I completely agree with you, but it's hard not to do that. But it's a very important point. That God knew what the outcome of this was going to be. Very true. Mm. Satan obeyed God. That's interesting. But in the same question, same token, we always know that God is in control, right? So Satan would have no power beyond what God allowed him to do, right? And that's one of the very clear things that we learn from this. If Satan had decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and kill Job anyways, would he have been able to? And I don't think that's true, because this is back to being tempted beyond what we can bear, right? He put these limits around what Satan can do. So he's allowing this trial to occur. He's allowing this test to occur, but he's still in control of what's going to happen, or he still knows what's going to happen, and he's still controlling the boundary of what's going to happen, and he's still limiting Satan's power and what Satan can do to Job. And that's something we see very clear here. Further, Satan needed permission to do what he did. Not only this, God constrained what Satan could do in chapter 1, verse 12. And what God says here is important for our consideration about how God runs the world. And I want to think about now the application for us, particularly in regards to suffering. the action that happened against Job didn't happen without God's knowledge, one, and God's agreement, two. And that's an interesting thing to think about. God knew what Job was going to go through, and God allowed Job to go through it. Also, he takes responsibility for what happened in Job chapter 2, verse 3. God does not say that Satan did this to Job, even though we know Satan did do this to Job. Rather, God says that he did it himself. You incited me against him to destroy him without reason. And if we, later on when we get to chapter 42, we'll see similar kind of language. When Job's friends, when they come to him to help celebrate that he's been restored and everything, we see that they're consoling him and comforting him against all of the adversities that the Lord had brought against him. Right? So this is notion again that God had done this to him. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's something we're going to bring up again as we go through the book here, but that's a really important point to make, is that Job is not aware of this discussion between God and Satan going on, and that these trials are coming before him because of this discussion that's being recorded. It's just, he just sees everything he gets destroyed, and he doesn't know why. And then later on, when God speaks to him, and God's telling him that all this stuff happened to him, there's still not a clear answer that, well, I had to allow Satan to do this because I'm trying to show Satan and try to teach him that he's wrong or trying to make this lesson. It was just, this is the way it happened. Zach? Mm. Yeah. Yeah, Job and his friends, we'll see as we go on, they're not blaming Satan for this. They're still talking about how God is doing this to Job. Jan? Mm-hmm. That's a very, very important question for us to tackle in Job. So, like I said, we're gonna get there as we go through the whole book. But this is what I mentioned. The first lesson is the purpose of this introduction is to destroy us, right? It's to tear us down and say, the way you think about the way God operates, you're wrong, right? It's like all these conclusions that we kind of draw in our lives that, well, if I go to church every Sunday, then I'm going to be on easy street, right? Like, no, that's not what God promises us ever in the Bible. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, we're spiritual beings. We're not here just for our some contents on this earth, right? And you're exactly right. The whole purpose of this is for us to wrestle with this question, to understand, so that when these things happen to us, we're going to have that armor, right, to deal with those situations, because they're going to happen to us. There's going to be bad things happen to us, and your point is very valid. That God's aware of who we are, and Satan's aware of who we are. And God is watching, and God is able to help, and God is in control, but Satan is also going to be accusing the entire time. He's going to be going before God and saying, well, yeah, but it's because of this, or do this, and he's going to leave you. And it's interesting, your point that God knew who Job was. He saw who Job was. He recognized who Job was. And he recognized that Job was righteous. And furthermore, I think he recognized that Job could withstand the test. And that's one reason why he allowed this to happen. Zach?
I think something to keep in mind here is, and this was kind of an answer to Dan's question, is that God is obviously portrayed as a king over a kingdom. And as a king, do you govern what happens in your kingdom? Answer, yes. But do you govern everything that happens in your kingdom? And I think that's no. Like, you can't control because there's free will and people do. Now, the ideal is that everyone would abide by the rules of the kingdom and that there would be no consequences of sin in that sense. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have control or that he doesn't want good things to happen.
Yeah.
Conversely, it's just he's a king over a kingdom and
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
That's a quick question. Do you think that when, even Job's friends, do you think that they're aware of the fact that Satan is at work? Because everything seems to point to God, throughout the chapter. It's you're suffering this because of you did something
Yeah.
wrong, and God is punished. Satan is never brought up to us. Do you think they're aware of the fact that Satan is actually working just as well as God?
Yeah, so this idea is that, are they aware that Satan is working in this? It doesn't seem to be, right? From the reaction of his friends and what we just talked about, like they're still attributing this to God. And again, this whole thing we've been discussing, God is still in control of what's going to happen. Back to Jan's point of all the bad things that happen in this world, the hurricanes that come through and destroy things, is that because God just kind of takes his hands off the wheel and lets it happen? Or is God controlling what's happening there? Like, that's an important question for us to tackle. And we're going to keep talking about that as we go through this entire passage. But the important point that we're going to get to towards the end of today's lesson, at least, is why would we expect good things to happen to us and only good things to happen to us because we're serving God? As Dave pointed out, it's not about this world. It's not about what's going on here on earth. God's concerned with the spiritual and is concerned with our souls and who we are, and not about the things that may or may not happen to us on this earth. Angie?
Blah, blah, blah. When we know that Satan is roaming this world, seeking whom he may devour.
Yep.
And knowing that, we as Christians know also that this world is not a home.
Yeah.
We are just passing through here. And good things are going to happen. We are going to be blessed, and there are going to be bad things. And we're going to watch Christians go through trials and tribulations. And I don't think the question is ever going to be why.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's not. This is just the way the world works. And
Yeah.
Satan is alive and well. And if we only talk about God and we don't talk about Satan, we're not doing this whole
Yeah.
here justice, but also just our living in this world. But when we also think that this makes or breaks who we are as Christians, or makes or breaks Job, then we are losing everything.
Yeah.
Because the story is so much bigger than that. And who are we to question how God did what he did?
Yeah.
And to me, he says that to Job.
It's important, right?
But it is. And
Who are we to question why God does what he does or how God operates?
not to try to do that and just say, okay, let me deal with what's happening.
That's a really good reminder, right? When we start thinking, well, maybe God's not the person we think he is, or maybe God is somehow evil or allowing us to, like, well, we need to take a step back and re-examine ourselves. Yeah.
I agree with Angie. In a way, we're being tested every day.
We're being tested every day.
Not like Job did, because God knew Job's heart. That's why he allowed Satan to do that, because Job was a righteous man. But we're being tested every day. Every time we walk out of this building, Satan's out there roaming, like
Yeah.
she said, walking all over the world, trying to see who he may devour.
Absolutely.
To us, the faith, and put all our faith and trust in God.
Yeah. Very true. Kyle? Yeah.
Whereas our life in heaven, that is about hope, and that's what these trials are supposed to be, a reminder of those things.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, for sure. When we have these trials, we can take them one of two ways. We can let them destroy us, or we can let them build our faith up even stronger than it was before. And that's what God clearly wants us to do. But that's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do, especially when you're in the midst of that struggle. Yeah. God is always with us for sure. And we're rapidly running out of time, and we're still in verse 3. But next question or the topic I thought I was gonna bring up is, though Satan is the one afflicting Job, we must also see that God declares that he himself has afflicted Job, and that's chapter 2, verse 3. You also see that in chapter 42, verse 11. So my next question was, does the idea of God afflicting Job bother you? That's what we've just been talking about, right? Does the idea that God has afflicted Job bother us? And that's the reason why we have the whole book of Job, right? This is still the introduction, right? This is setting us up to understand what's going to happen later, what's going to come through through this poetry that we're about to read. And this is going to hopefully help put our minds at ease. But the first part is to understand just what the situation is before we get into that. At the moment, so we must be patient, let God explain to us as we go through the book, I think is important. And at the moment, we're just left with the knowledge that Satan has afflicted Job, but God says he's also afflicted Job. So that's an important point for us to keep in the back of our minds as we go on. But we should also acknowledge that God still is asserting Job's righteousness again. God says that he has destroyed Job without reason. It's not because Job deserved it. It's not because this needed to happen to Job for any specific reason. Job is still righteous, and there's still no accusation that can be made against him. He still has not sinned, and he's not being punished because of his sins. And that's an important point to remember. His suffering is 100% undeserved. So we're going to go to verse 4 through 6. I think I'm going to skip reading that. Hopefully you've already read it. In this section here, we see Satan's accusation. So do you think Satan thinks Job has passed the test from chapter 1? It seems like he doesn't, or at least he says he doesn't, right? Because he makes a new accusation, right? He says that, well, yeah, but people really, what they care about is their life. Their life is the most important thing to them. If you really harm his health, then he's certainly going to curse you, and he's certainly going to turn away from you. People only really deep down care about themselves. So even though you took all of his possessions and things, you didn't actually touch Job. And since people only care about themselves, that's the reason why he hasn't turned his back on you yet. And his point is that, well, if you harm Job, and that will lead him to fail, that will lead him to curse you to your face. So Satan seems to think that health problems might be Job's breaking point. Is that a good accusation to make? Yeah? Does Satan think that health problems are a breaking point for us? I think that's probably true, right? We see a lot of people with health problems, and what's the result of having health problems? Discouragement, for sure, yeah. If we don't have that strong faith, that's enough to cause a lot of people to turn away from God. I've known of families that, maybe they have a baby, and the baby has health problems. And that's a real hard thing to tackle when you see, this innocent child, and suddenly he may have some horrible health affliction that's going to affect him his whole life. Is that fair to that child? And back to this notion, we want fairness here on earth. We want good things to happen because we're following God on earth, but we're not promised that. So I think it's an important thing for us to remember as well, is that Satan is going to use health problems as a way to attack us. Something we need to be strong about. Many people curse God and give up on God when their own health fails. Many people quit God due to their health. And it's true that sometimes people do just care about themselves. And the question for us is, do we care about ourselves so much that we only serve God when our health is good? Or do we care more about God and that we'll still continue to serve God, whether our health is good or whether our health is bad? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves before our health becomes bad, right? To really think about that. And then the last question on this section is, what would be the problem if Satan took Job's life? Because he says, like, you can't kill him. You can harm him all you want, but you can't kill him. What would be the problem if Satan just killed him? Yep, we touched on it for sure. It'd be the end of the story. We certainly wouldn't learn much from it, right? But and the whole point, again, is God has put these limits on what Satan is allowed to do. And furthermore, if he kills Job, we can't see if Job's going to curse God or not, right? And that's the whole point, is Satan is making this accusation against Job. He's trying to mock who God is. The whole point is to challenge God's power and his righteousness, and that the fact that he does good things is a problem, right? He's making these accusations. And if he just kills Job, then nothing comes from that.
When you stop and think about it, Job is just included in all the other books. The Old Testament is spoken of as our schoolmaster.
Yeah.
And, what would we know really about life if we didn't have these accounts in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
And, Job,
Yeah, all the things in the Old Testament, including the book of Job, are written so that we could learn things, right?
Joshua said, as for me and my house, so we have all of these examples
Excuse me.
to live by.
Very true. That's true, right? If Satan kills Job, then Satan loses because Job hasn't failed the test, right? So the whole point is to keep him alive and to make him absolutely miserable because he's trying to get Job to fail and to turn his back on God. Yeah. The apostles, that's a good connection to make. Yeah, the apostles suffered all horrible things and they were still killed. Yeah. That's a whole other lesson that we can talk about. Sorry. Yeah. Satan's kind of desperate to win here, right? So he's going to keep changing his tactics until he does, right? That's the thought in his mind. Back to again, Satan is continually accusing us, and he's going to keep changing his tactics until he wins, and that's his goal. So until we run the race to its completion and we pass from this world, we've got to be prepared for that. Those attack vectors that Satan's using are going to continually change, and that's another important point from Job. What happened if God killed Satan instead? That would certainly change the equation quite a bit. Yeah, we're certainly looking forward to that world in heaven, or that realm in heaven without Satan. That's what we want. Yeah, Jimmy. Yeah. Mm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could certainly make a really strong connection, again, back to the trials that we face and how we react to those, back to Kyle's point about our faith, right? Because if we lived on easy street and never had any problems, we might keep going, but our faith is not necessarily going to be that strong, right? It's going to be really hard to make it that strong, I'll put it that way. But if we're faced with these life-shaking trials that really make us question, who God is and how is God treating me and what's my relationship with God, and we pull ourselves through those, God helps us through those and we work through those situations, invariably our faith is going to be strengthened. So the fact that we're faced with these trials and these problems is ultimately for our spiritual lives a good thing, but it's all in how we react to them. And at the time, again, that's a really easy thing to say after the fact. But when that thing is burning at us, it's hard. Josh.
Satan is always looking to test Christians.
Yeah.
He's going to work by somebody that's already lost.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why God allowed him to test Job.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at some of the martyrs throughout the history of the Bible that were put to death because they were Christians. They never did denounce God, and Job didn't do that either.
Yeah.
That's what Satan was trying to get him to do.
Yeah.
Denounce God. That's why it says, curse God and die. And so he didn't.
Speaking of that, let's get to that section because there's a whole class we could talk about that, which we're probably not going to be able to finish today. But verses 7 through 9 of Job chapter 2. What happens to, and again, I'm not going to read it because we're out of time, but what happens to Job now in this section? We see that Satan goes back to God and makes this test. God allows him to strike Job, but he can't kill him. So we see that he gets these sores all over his body. In some translations, use the word boils. But in any case, he's in agony, right? Complete agony. How big of a problem is this for Job? Well, the intensity of his suffering is so great, he takes a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself with. And you just think of how bad that must be and must feel. He's also sitting in ashes. And the note is that this is probably the ash heap that was outside of the city where the trash was collected and burned. That was a common thing in those days. And the Septuagint, at least, apparently gives that kind of understanding to the text that says that he's on the dunghill outside of the city. So it's a picture that he's alienated, he's rejected, he's away, he's in pain, he's in complete and total misery. So what solution does Job's wife offer him for this situation? Curse God and die. It's a good question because what has she become to Job here? I mean, it's a very serious question. She's now become a new temptation to Job. So, in effect, it's making it even worse for Job because if she wasn't there to say this to him, there wouldn't be this additional temptation that comes. But yeah, she's exactly tempting him just as Satan is trying to tempt him here. Yeah, if we were suffering that bad, it might make us pass out or be unconscious. I think clearly, back to what Satan's doing, right? He wants Job to sit and stew in it, right? He wants Job to suffer. He doesn't want to kill him. He doesn't want to make him, pass out or something. He's trying to make him think and reflect and just agonize. Yes.
We are really hard on Job's wife, and she was totally wrong. Don't get me wrong there. But we're looking at two people who have gone through the same thing. And she has
That's the next part of my question.
the loss of 10 children, her affluence, her everything. And she is a broken woman. And you can see that in her response to her husband when she doesn't know, if you really just look at, I just can't not understand where she's coming from when she says it.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether she just said it out and really meant it or just was so angry or hurt or just in such grief that she lost it like that. Because we don't know the next children he has, who he has. I don't know anything. I don't remember all of that, if that's even. But two people who have gone through losing everything, Job stands firm and she falls, basically. And he needed as much help as he did.
Yeah.
And so I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, so my next question was, what do you think of Job's wife? And then the second part is, should we be critical of Job's wife? And I think you've nailed it right there, is she's not doing this because she hates Job or because it's illogical, right? From her logic, it makes perfect sense. You're suffering, you're in agony, God has clearly left you, in her view, so why keep living, right? What's the purpose, right? If you're going to be miserable and suffer and have all this turmoil, you might as well just end your life and move on, right? Jan?
And I think that's more what some of us really be thinking. Take away all your children, all your the wealth you might give up in property, children, that just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
And I've just always read Job as being super. I don't think anybody now who could go through all that
Yeah.
and not lose something. That's just an extra frustrating.
Yeah.
And she's not a real
Right. I think you make a very good point, right? Her reaction is not unexpected, right? Her reaction is one of, again, if I'm serving God and I've lost absolutely everything and I'm on the verge of death and I'm going to die anyways, why suffer another month or 2 or 3? Why not just be done with it now? And we think about people that are facing problems and turmoil and how suicide comes up in their minds. It's the same kind of notion, right? It's like, well, if I'm going to be righteous and it's going to cost me my life, then why prolong my agony? Why not end it? And that's, again, another huge lesson for us to take from Job. Kicking it into turbo mode here, but one thing I want us to really think about is that Satan is afflicting Job, but other people are suffering too, right? Job's wife, up until this point of the sword, she has suffered just as bad as Job has. She, again, lost her family, lost her wealth, lost her possessions, lost everything she had. Just because you are suffering does not mean that you are the one that's on trial. And that seems to contradict our normal way of thinking, right? If we see suffering, we think we must be on trial. That problem must be coming for us. You may not be the object of a trial, but you may still experience the pain of suffering anyways. And Job's wife was not the scope of Satan's challenge, but she's suffering anyways. Remember chapter 1, when the servants came to report what had happened. This bad thing happened that came down that killed everybody, and I alone escaped. Think of all these servants that Job had that died at the same time, right? They lost their lives in the process, and it was all in the test of Job. Let's see. Often we forget that our lives are interconnected. The choices that you make and the things that you experience in life affect more than just who you are. Your sins affect other people, and their sins affect you. Your trials in life affect other people, and other people's trials affect you. Just because you're suffering does not mean that what is happening to you is about you. And in this way, one trial becomes many people's trials. Job is experiencing suffering, and Job's wife is experiencing suffering. Her solution is to curse God and die. Question is, what's Job's response? And that's verse 10. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, did Job not sin with his lips? And I guess that's where we're going to have to end it at today. But Job's response is the opposite, right? I've got too much to go through right there. But the whole point is that Job is not turning his back on God. He loves God and appreciates God for all of his blessings. And in the absence of blessings, he knows that God doesn't owe him anything else.